August 12, 1940. The Isle of Wight, just before noon. High above the chalk cliffs, a German bomber pilot named Oberst Dr. Johannes Visser pushed his aircraft into a dive. Below him stood his target. Not an airfield, not a factory. A cluster of tall, ugly steel towers standing in a field near the village of Ventnor. To the German High Command, these towers were a joke. Skeletal lattice masts, strung with wires, looking less like a war machine and more like an unfinished electricity pylon. The Germans had real radar. Sleek, precise, modern. The British had this. A scrapyard on stilts. Visser dropped 4 bombs straight onto the site. The blast tore the operations huts apart. For a few hours, the screens of Ventnor went dark, and the Luftwaffe believed it had proven something, that these crude British towers were as flimsy as they looked. They were wrong, badly, fatally wrong, because those ugly towers had already done the one thing that would decide the entire battle. They had seen the Germans coming. This is the story of the radar that lost the technology race and won the war anyway. To understand why those towers mattered, you have to understand the problem Britain was staring at in the summer of 1940. France had fallen. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, now sat on airfields just across the English Channel, a strip of water barely 20 miles wide at its narrowest point. From those fields, German bombers could be over English cities in minutes. And Britain had a math problem it could not solve. The Royal Air Force was outnumbered. It did not have enough fighter planes to win a straight fight against the full weight of the Luftwaffe. Every commander knew it. There was an even worse problem underneath that one: finding the bombers at all. In 1940, the only way to know enemy planes were coming was to see them or hear them. Men with binoculars. Sound detectors shaped like giant concrete ears. By the time anyone spotted a raid, the bombers were already close. That left the RAF with a brutal choice. They could fly standing patrols, keeping fighters in the air all day, every day, just in case. But planes burn fuel and pilots burn out. Keep them up constantly and you have nothing left when the real attack lands. Or they could wait on the ground and scramble only when a raid appeared, but scramble too late and the bombers are already overhead, dropping their loads before a single British fighter can climb to meet them. A smaller air force flying blind. That was the position. Numbers said Britain should lose. And on the other side of the channel sat an enemy that was, in pure engineering terms, ahead. The Germans had radar too. Better radar. They had a set called Freya, a sharp early warning system that could pick up aircraft cleanly. And they had Würzburg, a precision tracker that worked on tiny centimeter wavelengths, accurate enough to guide guns and night fighters onto a single plane. German radar was the better box. Nobody serious disputes that. So how does the side with fewer planes and the cruder technology win? The answer started 5 years earlier with a Scottish scientist and a strange request from the British government. It was 1935 and the Air Ministry was chasing a fantasy, a death ray. Officials wanted to know if radio waves could be focused into a beam strong enough to kill an enemy pilot or melt an engine in flight. They asked a radio expert named Robert Watson Watt to look into it. Watson Watt did the calculations and gave them the bad news. A death ray was impossible. The energy required was absurd. But he added a second thought, almost in passing, and that second thought changed history. You could not destroy an aircraft with radio waves, but you might be able to detect one. On the 26th of February, 1935, he proved it. The test was almost laughably simple. A BBC shortwave radio transmitter was already broadcasting near the town of Daventry. Watson Watt parked a van in a nearby field, fitted with a receiver. Then he had an RAF bomber, a Handley Page Hayford, fly back and forth through the path of the radio signal. Every time the bomber crossed the beam, it bounced a faint echo of the radio waves back toward the van. A line on a small screen flickered and jumped. They tracked that bomber from about 8 miles away using nothing but a radio station and a borrowed plane. The aircraft had announced itself without knowing it. That flicker on a screen was the seed of everything. Within 2 years, Britain was building a chain of these detection stations along its coast. The official codename was RDF, Radio Direction Finding, a deliberately boring label to hide what it really was. History would call it Chain Home. Now, here is where the British did something that looked, to German eyes, like a downgrade. The Chain Home stations were huge and primitive. Each station needed 2 sets of towers. The transmitter towers were steel, standing about 360 feet tall, taller than most cathedrals. The receiver towers were wood, about 240 feet tall. Between them hung curtains of wire antennas. Nothing rotated, nothing swept. There was no dish. Instead of a tight beam scanning the sky, Chain Home simply floodlit the whole sky in front of it with a wall of radio pulses, then listened for the echoes bouncing back off anything in the air. The transmitter sat in one place and the receiver sat in another. Crude, power-hungry, inelegant. And it ran on long radio waves, roughly 10 to 13 meters. That is enormous in radar terms, and it caused real problems. Long waves cannot pinpoint a target precisely. They struggle badly to see planes flying low to the ground. A German engineer looking at Chain Home would have seen a clumsy, blunt instrument next to his own precise Würzburg. But the long waves did one thing brilliantly. They reached out. A typical Chain Home station could pick up aircraft about 120 miles away. Bombers climbing high at 15,000 feet could be spotted from nearly 150 miles out, while they were still gathering into formation over France. Think about what that distance buys you. A German raid forming up over the French coast was now visible long before it crossed the water. The RAF was no longer blind. It had, on a good day, around 20 minutes of warning. 20 minutes to wake up the right squadrons, point them in the right direction, and send them to the right height. That was the trade the British made. They gave up precision and got reach. They could not see exactly where each plane was, but they could see that the storm was coming, and roughly from where, while it was still far out to sea. There was still a gap though, and the Germans could have used it. Chain Home was nearly useless against aircraft coming in low, skimming the waves to stay under the radio waves. So the British bolted on a second system called Chain Home Low. It used a much shorter wavelength, about 1.5 meters, and a rotating antenna that swept the sky. It could catch planes flying as low as 500 feet, out to about 45 miles. The high net and the low net together closed the door. By the summer of 1940, the threatened coast was ringed. Around 20 Chain Home stations for the high cover, around 30 Chain Home Low stations for the low cover. The towers were up. The sky was being watched. But a tower that sees a bomber is just a tower. The radar was never the weapon, it was only the eyes. And this is the part of the story the Germans never understood, because it was invisible. It had no towers. You could not bomb it. A Chain Home station spotting a raid did not control any fighters, it simply picked up a phone. The plot, the rough position of the raid out over the water, was telephoned inland. And the moment those bombers crossed the English coastline, where the radar grew unreliable, the watching was handed off to a second set of eyes, the Royal Observer Corps. Thousands of volunteers on the ground with binoculars and telephones, tracking the raids visually as they passed overhead. All of it, the radar plots from the coast and the eyeball reports from inland, flowed to one place. A grand country house called Bentley Priory, the headquarters of Fighter Command. Inside was a room that won the Battle of Britain, and it was full of women. In the filter room, members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force took in the flood of messages, and it was a mess. Different stations reported the same raid differently. Numbers conflicted. Heights disagreed. The job of these women, the plotters and the tellers, was to take that chaos and turn it into clarity. They filtered the contradictions, merged the duplicates, and produced a single clean track for each raid. One arrow on one giant map table, showing where a raid was, how big it was, and where it was heading. That filtered picture then flowed downward, to group headquarters, then to sector operations rooms, the people who actually scrambled the squadrons. Because the picture was clean and fast, a controller could send exactly the right number of fighters to exactly the right place, at exactly the right altitude, to meet a raid as it arrived. This was the thing that had no name in 1940 and now has one. The Dowding System, named for the head of Fighter Command, Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding. It is widely called the world's first integrated air defense network. Radar, telephones, observers, filterers, and controllers, all stitched into one nervous system that turned a flicker on a screen into a fighter in the right patch of sky. And this is what solved Britain's impossible math. The RAF was still outnumbered, but it no longer had to fly wasteful patrols or guess where to go. It could keep its fighters on the ground, safe and rested, then launch them only when needed, straight at the threat. The system multiplied a smaller force by deleting the guesswork. An outnumbered air force could now meet each raid head-on, because it always knew where the raid was. The Germans had the better radar boxes. The British had built the better machine around theirs. If you are starting to see why those ugly towers mattered more than they looked, subscribe before we get to the moment the Luftwaffe tried to tear them down. Because by August 1940, the Germans had finally decided to do exactly that. The Luftwaffe had begun to sense that something was helping the RAF. British fighters kept appearing in the right place at the right time with uncanny consistency, as if they knew. Suspicion fell on the strange towers along the coast. So on the 12th of August 1940, the day before the Germans launched their main assault, they went after the radar chain directly. It was a coordinated strike. Stations at Rye, Pevensey, Dunkirk and Ventnor were all hit. This was the raid that sent Oberst Dr. Johannes Visser diving on Ventnor with 4 bombs. And on the surface, the attack looked like a success. Ventnor, on the Isle of Wight, was knocked clean off the air. The operations buildings were wrecked. But step closer and the picture falls apart. Look at the towers themselves. The bombs came down, the blast rolled out, and the open steel lattice just let it pass straight through. There was almost nothing solid for the explosion to push against. No flat walls to flatten, no sealed building to crush. The girders shrugged. The damage was to the huts and equipment at the base, not to the great masts overhead, and damaged huts could be repaired in days. The other stations proved it. Rye, Pevensey, Dunkirk, badly knocked about, were back in working order by the next morning. They simply would not stay down. Ventnor was the hardest hit, out of action for about 11 days. But even Ventnor refused to leave the Germans a real opening. The British rushed a mobile radar unit to the island to cover the hole and made sure the radio signals kept going out so that, to a German listening in, the station seemed to be transmitting as if nothing had happened. Where the British could not repair fast, they faked. The gap the Germans thought they had torn in the chain was quietly stitched shut or papered over before it could matter. So the Luftwaffe ran the experiment, and the experiment came back with a brutal answer. They had thrown bombs at the towers, and within hours and days, the towers were watching them again. And here the German High Command made the decision that may have cost them the battle. Seeing the stations come back on air so quickly, they concluded that radar sites were simply too tough to bother with. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, summed it up. He said it was doubtful whether there was any point in continuing attacks on the radar sites, given that not one of those attacked had so far been put out of action. Read that again, knowing what we know. The man running the German Air Force looked at the single most important target in Britain and decided it was a waste of bombs. It was one of the great misjudgments of the war. The towers were not indestructible. The Germans absolutely could damage them, had damaged them, and with sustained, repeated attacks might have blinded long stretches of coast at the worst possible time. The British system had real limits, and a determined campaign against it might have found them. The Germans simply stopped. They judged the towers not worth their time and turned their bombers toward airfields and, later, toward cities. That choice left Britain's early warning chain standing and watching through the entire decisive phase of the battle in the summer and autumn of 1940. Every major raid that came after, the RAF saw coming. The eyes stayed open because the enemy decided closing them was too much effort. So who really won the Battle of Britain in the air? It was not the radar. Let us be honest about that, because the truth is more interesting than the myth. Chainholm was not a technical marvel. It was beaten on pure performance by Germany's own Freya and Würzburg sets. The British did not win because their box was better, their box was worse. They won because of what they wired the box into. The Germans had superior radar that fed almost nothing, excellent eyes attached to a slow and clumsy body. The British had inferior radar feeding the fastest decision-making machine in the world. Mediocre eyes attached to a lightning reflex. That is the whole inversion. The advantage was never the hardware, it was the human network behind it. The observers on the hills. The women filtering chaos into a single clean arrow at Bentley Priory. The controllers scrambling the exact right squadron. The towers were only the first link in a chain that the Germans never saw, because most of it had no physical form to bomb. The Luftwaffe looked at Chainholm and saw ugly, primitive towers that bombs passed straight through. They were right about the towers. They were just looking at the wrong thing. Those crude masts gave an outnumbered air force the one thing it could not get any other way: time. 20 minutes of warning, again and again, all summer long. Enough time to turn a hopeless math problem into a fighting chance, and a fighting chance into victory. The joke towers had the last laugh, and the men who dismissed them as a scrapyard on stilts spent the rest of the war wondering how a country with worse radar kept seeing them coming. If you want to see how Britain turned other so-called inferior weapons into war winners the Germans never respected until it was too late, the next video is waiting for you on screen.